So we did a big retrospective series on the Friday the 13th films over the last year. So I think 2025, I really want to tell the story about my history with the Elm Street films. I had a lot of fun with that. So hopefully you guys are down for the journey. And as usual, just like Friday the 13th, I'm going out of order. For some reason, it feels more fun that way, and it gets to keep you guys on your toes a little bit, not knowing which one's coming next. So I wanted to start with one of the more interesting sequels, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. Now, this is a movie that definitely has a more negative reputation compared to a lot of the sequels in the series. For some reason, this is one that I can't help but want to sort of defend just a little bit. Now, that's not to say that I don't think this film is perfect, but let's get into that in a little bit. So here's the story of how I found these Elm Street films and getting to Part 5. Eventually, I'll tell you the story about A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, which was the very first A Nightmare on Elm Street film I ever saw. Long story short, it was just like the Friday the 13th films, to where at the point of getting into the Nightmare films, I had already begun becoming a physical media collector, and so I was really excited to own these films. The place to go was none other than FYE. And just like the Friday the 13th movies, I would buy the Elm Street films more or less out of order because it just depended on what they had in stock. I can't exactly remember which time I picked up Part 5, but I do know that I had seen 1, 2, and 3 before seeing Part 5. So I had begun to see the evolution of what the character of Freddy Krueger would do, which has become a little bit more comedic and less serious, divvying away from the dark nature that the character had from the beginning. But honestly, I was there for the ride, because at that point, even though I wasn't a horror fanatic or I was becoming one, it's not like Freddy was seen that way to begin with. I mean, in pop culture, he was kind of lovable. Everybody at least knew who Freddy was, and he was talked about in a loving nature. He is a horror icon, and by 2009 standards, that was definitely the case. People just loved Freddy. So I remember getting home and looking at the DVD cover, and it was interesting because when I looked at the makeup of Robert, I thought maybe this movie came out a lot later, not looking at the date, realizing it was 89, because the makeup on the cover of Part 5 makes it look like Freddy was actually like an old man. Now, in retrospect, learning now that Nightmare on Elm Street 5 came out pretty much less than a year from 4 is funny to me, because when I looked at the cover, I thought, oh, this one must have come out in like, I don't know, 2001, 2000. But as soon as I started the movie, it was pretty apparent that it was still the late 80s. Getting it out now, just in the beginning, I don't think that I disliked this movie, but there was so much going on with the Elm Street films, to process it kind of takes a few watches. Now, when you go to the Friday the 13th films, clearly they are bread and butter horror movies. They are slasher character, woods, victims. But with Elm Street, there's always something going on, it seems like. Even just the kill sequences. I mean, Freddy does some of the most outlandish things that I couldn't believe watching it, like that somebody had come up with this idea. And honestly, I think Part 5 is no exception. As a matter of fact, there are things about A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 that to this very day I absolutely love. For instance, when I was watching this movie for the first time, when I see Dan going to ride his motorcycle in this weird dream sequence to try to save his girlfriend, the shot of him turning into this motorbike where the cables and everything starts flooding into his body, it was truly baffling. I was like, wow, somebody came up with this idea? It was crazy. Now, it's still done in a silly nature, obviously, because of the fact that Freddy is just teasing him the entire time. But what really got to me was when I learned after the fact that this movie actually had an uncut version. So right here's the VHS, which I got from my pal Gabe. Gabe, if you're watching this, thank you. But at the time, I decided I needed to get this on Laserdisc because that was uncut as well. So when I got the uncut version of Part 5 on Laserdisc, I was blown away by how much further it went. The things that really creeped me out, though, was how painful that sequence is. I would argue that the motorcycle sequence from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 is as brutal as anything from a Halloween film. Those cables digging into the back of his calves and riding up his skin are just truly painful to look at. It's one of the more inventive kills in the series. So just from that standpoint, I give a lot of credit to Part 5 for being creative. There were other moments of the film that truly got to me, how gross they were or just how bizarre they were. There's a shot in the movie where Alice opens up her fridge and you see her friend Greta peering out of it with food stuffed in her mouth, and it was something out of like a Tim Burton movie or something. It had this really bizarre nature to it. That's a sequence that I still really enjoy. And we can't not talk about my first time seeing Baby Freddy. I don't know what it was. There are just moments in your life where you see something and you're drawn to it or you fall in love with it. You can't really explain why or what it is that made you love it, but Obviously, if you're a fan of this channel, you know I love Baby Freddy. As a matter of fact, I have one right over there, and he sits in the horror room, and it's one of my favorite pieces I own. It was actually made by David Miller himself, which, if you recognize that name, you know David Miller was actually the guy who created the makeup for Freddy. So that's another thing that I enjoyed about Part 5 was that David Miller came back to work on another Elm Street film. When he designed the makeup for Freddy in Part 5, he felt that he overdid it in Part 1, so that's why the makeup is a little bit smoother, I guess, in Part 5. It's not like he looks normal, but Freddy's makeup is a little less intricate. It's neither here or there for me. I just think it's another evolution of the character's look. If I can forgive Jason looking totally different from movie to movie, I guess I'm okay with Freddy, who's a literal nightmarish demon, have a slightly different appearance from movie to movie. But let's get back to me experiencing the movie for the first time. I guess when I was watching it, I was a little confused. And to be honest with you, I'm still a little confused on how everything works. Alice doesn't necessarily have the dreams. It's the baby's dreams, but Alice experiences the dreams. But I always wonder when she's sleeping. There are moments that kind of confuse me a little bit. The concept of Part 5 is actually pretty interesting. It deals with adult themes, which when you look at the series, New Line's thought process was, well, the people that were watching these movies are now growing up. It was now 5 years later, so maybe these were early teens checking out these movies and now they're close to 20. So let's talk about something that's a little bit more adult-oriented with themes of abortion in the movie and things like that, which I guess I can appreciate. But what's interesting is you learn that the script that was used for this movie was a throwaway script that got passed on a couple years prior. Now, the gentleman who pitched The Dream Child was pitching this idea back around the Dream Warrior days, and New Line thought it was a bad idea. So it's interesting now that, you know, Sarah Reicher, who was a producer for New Line back in the day, decided to want to go back and do that. That on itself kind of makes this film feel like an afterthought, which is kind of unfortunate. I'm not saying I think Part 5 is an afterthought, but there are definitely elements involved with the making of this that definitely make it feel like a money sequel. Let's just get another one out because we need to get another one out. That's just the reality of the movie business. Even though there are sequels of movies I love, like, I don't know, Friday Part 7 or Halloween 4, they're all done because we need to make money. It's a property that continues to make money, so let's just crank another one out. Part 5 is an interesting one. It feels rushed, but then at the same time, there are sequences that just look really cool. When you look at the timeline, the director of this film described being so rushed, if he looked at the schedule today, he would laugh at the idea of trying to recreate this film again, which is interesting to think about because how fast were they making movies back then? Especially when they weren't shooting digital, everything was on film. Probably a hell of a lot of cocaine being used back in the day to crank these movies out. Because I think timeline-wise, Nightmare Part 5 came out extremely fast after Part 4. It might have been less than a year. So that goes to show that, yeah, they were just cranking them out. I think for a lot of people, there's a little bit of an underwhelming feeling for Part 5, and I guess I can understand that. The plot of the movie isn't bad, but it's also not the greatest. But what I do give credit for is I do think that there are characters that are fairly memorable. Seeing Alice again was obviously a good thing to do because if you ask me, I'm an Alice guy and she's the best final girl from the series. But the other characters I thought were pretty cool. I really like the guy who's the comic book character. It's something that I think the director wrote, which is something that he kind of is. So that was really him putting himself in the movie. And even though Super Freddy is so over the top, I think it works in the nature of that character. It's actually a really fun scene to watch. I really hope that when these movies come out on 4K, Part 5 looks great, because to see all that optical effect stuff that was done in Part 5 would be so cool. And one thing I like about this movie too is that the director of this film loved old school effects. There's stop motion in here, there's optical effects, there's forced perspectives. This is where I kind of start to defend Part 5 a little bit when people just say it's, you know, a bad movie. I'll meet you halfway. I don't think it's as good as 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. But what I will say is there was some really creative stuff done here. And I love the old school effects stuff because if you look at this movie, it's almost like this final showcase of effects that were all done the old school ways. And the director clearly loves it. And it works because the movies are in fact nightmares, so everything should look a little dreamy and not realistic. Another thing about Part 5 I really like is there's this gothic soundtrack that the movie has, which gives it its own unique perspective. And also the use of Freddy's mom coming into the fray of this. You could argue that really no ending of the Elm Street film is great, especially because Freddy's not real. He's just a dream. He can come back regardless. But I think having the mom element in here is far from the worst ending that we've seen in the Elm Street series. I mean, for God's sakes, I love Freddy's Dead, but I think that's one of the worst endings of the entire franchise. So the element with the mom is not bad. It's not great, but I actually think this one is far from the worst. Introducing Alice's kid in here is something that that just feels so sequel-esque. You know, those scenes with the kid, especially by the end when he has Freddy makeup on his face, and then there's a scene where he barfs and it shoves this long Freddy snake through Freddy's chest. The ending makes no sense. This is why I say, if I was going to describe how the mechanics of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 worked, I really can't totally do that. And not trying to dismiss that, but at the same time, I've seen this movie so many times now over the years, it's just become an old friend. There's something about Part 5 I'll always inherently want to defend, because despite every flaw that the movie has, the story in terms of the rush nature of it, the guy who directed this film clearly has a love for the genre. By creating a unique soundtrack for the movie with these gothic overtones, by using stop motion, by using optical effects, by using another myriad of old school effect styles, this movie just has this overwhelming feeling of charm to it that I just will always love. The addition of Baby Freddy is something that is as silly and zany as it is, it's just lovely to see on screen. I mean, I love Baby Freddy. But I think the work that went into this film, despite the problems that are really more geared towards Bob Shea and just rushing out more sequels, there are things about this film that I think are superior to the other 89 slasher films. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Jason Takes Manhattan and Halloween 5, but if you're going to look at the big three from 89, I think watching them back to back, to me it's pretty clear that Nightmare on Elm Street 5 has the best stuff visually out of all of them. And in terms of just the quality of a film, I mean, we can't really say that Jason Takes Manhattan or Halloween 5 story makes all that great of sense either. A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 is the best out of the three of them. Something about that late 80s feel, cranking out that one more Elm Street film for the decade that Freddy just dominated. It's just something that's very special to me. And I love Robert in the movie. Despite what anybody says about these sequels, it's pretty unanimous that everybody agrees that regardless of the movie and what people think about it, Robert is always on point. He is Freddy. Watching these movies again to do these retrospectives, it's just clear to me there will never be anybody else that can be Freddy the way Robert is. Robert is Freddy to what Stallone is to Rocky. And I've just accepted that. I just can't shy away that I love A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5. I've gone back to this movie a lot. It's not like I can expect anyone to go back and watch this and decide that this is the best Elm Street film. But when I think you look at everything as a whole, and you look at the way this movie came about with a lot of uphill battles, a director working with a script that was clearly a throwaway from a few years earlier, a director working against a timeline that is probably inhumane and illegal by today's standards, he gave it hell. And I think some of the characters in here were well defined. There's characters from this movie that you can never confuse from any other sequel. And there's something so inherently 1989 about this film that I just love it. Something about movies from 1989, I've watched so many of them by this point that I could just tell when it's a 1989 film. And I love the feel of those. It's the last A Nightmare on Elm Street film. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, no, it's not, Christian. Just wait a couple years. But it's the last one to be called A Nightmare on Elm Street. After that was Freddy's Dead. And after that was New Nightmare. And after that was Freddy vs. Jason. It wasn't until 2010 when there was the remake, but I don't want to say I'm not counting that, but I think you get what I mean. There's something so inherently charming about the Dream Child, and ever since watching it for the first time, I thought to myself, you know what? That really wasn't that bad. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.